Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hi, I'm Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. This show is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. When producing a branded podcast, there are a lot of moving parts, and there are a lot of roles involved to get every episode published. But a key aspect of podcast production is feedback, whether it's feedback from customers, listeners, or even your own team members. Nolan McCoy is the head of video and creative content at Chili Piper. Spearheads a lot of the post-production efforts for the company's podcast, Demand Gen Chat. And in this episode, we'll uncover how feedback between Nolan and the podcast host helps fuel improvements with each and every episode. All right, cool. Well, first things first, Nolan, thanks for joining me on Recorded Content today.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. Thanks for having me.
Well, I was checking out your LinkedIn, and the headline or subheading, you mentioned that you like to talk about four things: video, marketing, creativity, and podcasting. And today we're going to talk a lot about podcasting, and video is certainly a part of that. But I wanted to ask, why do you feel it's important for you to talk about creativity so much as a marketer?
That's a great question. B2B specifically is the space I'm in. And traditionally, I think everyone could agree, B2B has traditionally been boring, and it's been very lacking in terms of depth and creativity and heart. And you go to like the B2C world and you have these brands that are just capturing everybody's attention and their almost their emotions through really creative stuff. And I think that there's just generally a void. There's some companies that do it really well, but I think that there's just a ripe opportunity to be able to think about B2B, in a more creative way, because at the end of the day, the same people who you're selling to at B2B are the same people who are in B2C. We're all humans selling to humans. And I don't think that there should really be a difference between B2C and B2B in terms of creativity. Obviously, it's different methods and it's different language and it's different ways that we talk, but visually and the way that we think about unique and new ideas, I think that's really where people get caught up. It's well, it's different. And it's it's not.
Yeah.
We're still humans. We're still people selling to people. And so let's capture their attention and invoke emotion in them through creative, videos or podcasts or graphics or even just LinkedIn content that's just different, that cuts through the noise.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you mentioned the word opportunity. And I really think that that's what it is for a lot of companies. It's that ability to use more creativity in what they produce and how they share information. And I know your title has creative content actually in the title for you at Chili Piper. And I was wondering, what do you and your company feel what do you categorize as creative content?
Our CEO defined my role. We had just recently hired a creative director of brand and UI. And the thought was, hey, let's define, these two roles, because as head of video and creative content, what's different between that and brand and UI work? And really it's creative content is our go-to-market content that's living on LinkedIn, that's living on YouTube, that's going on to all of our different channels where people are consuming content and, infusing creativity and meeting our audience in all those different channels, as opposed to creating assets for the brand in the company, for the website, for the different kind of more traditional internal channels.
Got it. Yeah, it seems like a pretty logical segmentation there. So so considering you're on that external facing side, you're producing content that is on the go-to-market side of things. The Demand Gen Chat show is a big piece of that. And we're going to talk through a lot of that today. But when I was looking through everything, the show started back in 2019 before you arrived at Chili Piper. And then I know it went on a little break, and then it came back in I believe April of last year. So tell me a little bit about, how that show resurrected there. What was the spark that allowed it to come back?
Yeah. So like you mentioned, Demand Gen Chat started as kind of a passion project from one of our uh, people in the marketing team back in 2019. And then, produced some episodes, and then that person eventually moved on and went to a different company. And we still retained the episodes. They just lived on, I think SoundCloud was where they were hosted at the time. Just
Yeah,
scrappy startup hosting our podcast on SoundCloud. But
that's right.
um,
It's on the internet. That's
it's
all that
on the
matters.
internet. It's
Yeah.
there. But then I stepped into my role in early 2021, and one of the first things that I got connected with was our director of demand gen, Kaylee, and she shared this desire to start a branded podcast at Chili Piper, but still was built upon her personal brand and was, felt like an opportunity, kind of like we'd started this action and it's like it's been dormant too long. And it was basically just like, let's restart this thing. Kaylee's like, I've never been a podcast host. I've never hosted one before, but I want to do this, and it's going to be a challenge. I want to be stretched. I want to do it. So let's make it happen.
And you and Kaylee, you mentioned are part of the marketing team, and you mentioned there's a new role that just was created. Really,
hmm
what does your marketing team look like at the moment?
So I would say it's probably a pretty traditional marketing team in terms of, size for our company. We have, a demand gen team. We have a content marketing team. We have SEO and PR and community partnerships, social, video, and then you throw podcasting kind of into my world as well. We're a team of probably, I would say we're almost near 30 people now. So it's a healthy marketing team, all looking after
Yeah.
different, couple roles in each of those departments that I mentioned. Yeah.
And
hmm
with those 30 people, obviously you're very active with the podcast itself. Kaylee is hosting on the
hmm
hosting side. What other parts are in play on your team? Is it mostly you two working together, or what are the other folks involved there?
So it really started with just both of us being heads down, and a lot of it, I've had experience launching a branded podcast in a previous role. And so it was bringing that experience, the tooling suggestions, the tech stack, all of that. And then also just really meeting with Kaylee and coaching her, helping her think through host and guest relationship, through even just, when to take the reins in on a conversation, like, just building that confidence as a host. I've personally never hosted a podcast, but my background is in video production and conducting interviews, and a lot of that I think translates into this world. It's just a different medium of storytelling, but it's a lot of the things translate. And so it was really the both of us just kind of starting this from nothing and working together. And then, as we started to think through more distribution and through even some paid spend and all that kind of stuff, then we started involving other pieces of the marketing team. Obviously, there needed to be collaboration between social media to put out our audiograms. There needed to be the demand gen team was putting some paid spend behind some of our audiograms. We were running them as ads to
Yeah.
promote depending on the host or the guest. And then, it's me collaborating as SEO, like optimizing our landing page for that episode with the transcript and doing all the stuff, like just trying to leverage all of our team members to help this be as an effective distribution as possible. Because I believe, and I think where a lot of people get B2B podcasts wrong is the distribution. It's like,
Yeah.
hey, if I just get on a call, if I just hit record, we have this conversation, and then I throw it up on YouTube, it's done. And it's like,
hmm
no, that's like that you've done 50% of the work, even though it feels like 100% because you just poured your heart out on a call for an hour or whatever. But
Yeah.
it's when you start to meet your audience where they're at, getting it in front of eyeballs, making sure it's ranking, making sure that you're releasing it on a regular cadence, like I just think that's where a lot of people get it wrong. And so it was, how can we leverage our team, because we're a healthy marketing team, to be effective as possible?
And Nolan, when you say you get it wrong, is that something that you learned from experience, where you did put in all this work into an episode and you weren't getting enough? I mean, where did you come to that realization?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of trial and error, like you mentioned, like just figuring it out along the way. But then also, again, taking a lot of that video marketing experience and applying that to podcasting, because, you create an interview with let's say you're doing a case study on a customer. You sit down, you have a call, there you're on an interview for an hour. you're drawing things out of them. You're asking very intentional questions to be able to speak to your audience. There's a lot of parallels to a podcast. And then when you're done with that call, then what do you do with it? Well, you put the full case study up on your website, but you cut it into social clips and you're going to put it on your LinkedIn. You're going to put it here. You're going to turn it into a YouTube pre-roll ad. Like there's different things you're going to do, and the distribution is pretty similar. And so I think the mistakes that, I think you can make in video marketing and the things I've made translate also over there as well.
And that's why I wanted to bring you on the show, actually, because I saw you on the Descript live webinar for one
Yeah.
of their season where you were asking questions. They brought you on stage, so to speak, and I was
Yeah.
like, oh, here's a gentleman that's asking some nerdy questions about video. I said we could probably chat a little bit and go through this as it relates to podcasting. But I think your background in video is interesting because that's really my background too. So
Mhm.
Motion's my second video agency, and very much like you, I've been behind the camera a lot
Mhm.
in my career and conducting these interviews that fit more of a documentary style filmmaking approach. I've done it for corporations, nonprofits for years, and I feel like that it was almost like a downshift into podcasting where it's like I've been asking questions for so long and trying to, share information in this way that on the podcasting side, it was kind of a natural transition there. So, and it sounds like you brought a lot of that experience to Chili Piper with
Mhm.
this podcast, where
Mhm.
you're working with a new host. You're able to share some of that along the way. So let's walk through then how an episode gets developed for
Mhm.
Demand Gen Chat. Let's even start to where you're working with the host, Kaylee, to find a guest for the show? Like how do you develop an idea for an episode? How does that work?
It's definitely a system that needs some improvement in terms of scalability because, we're two people, but then we also both have responsibilities within the organization outside of podcasting. I'm not a full-time podcast producer or editor, and she's not a
Yeah.
full-time podcast host, personality evangelist, or anything like that. So it's definitely been a little bit of trial and error in the production side of things, but really it would either be, Kaylee's looking at opportunities for guests that, dream guests to obviously have on your podcast. You always have that list. But then it's also strategic guests that, are speaking about something relevant in the space that we think is current for the demand gen audience. It's also, us probably Slack DMing a bunch, just like, hey, look at this
Yeah.
interesting LinkedIn post from this person. This might be a great guest. Like they seem to be kind of hitting on our wavelength. And then, you add it to your Google sheet. There it is. There's your list of potential guests. And then Kaylee really was handling the outreach because of her personal brand and her leverage there. And then was getting them to the point of scheduling the call. And then once the interview's recorded, then obviously it all came onto my plate and took it on from there.
And with Kaylee doing the outreach, because that's always a question that we get is how do you get guests? And
Hmm.
when we're working with teams, sometimes um, that's an obstacle or just an area of uncertainty where they're unsure of how to get guests. And if you do see a LinkedIn post out there that creates this spark, and it's like, oh, that is the perfect thing to dive into in a podcast episode. Who should do the outreach? Who should try to bring them on the show? So, why do you feel it works really well to have the host do that? Like, how has that worked for you all?
I think if Kaylee wasn't building a LinkedIn presence for herself, I think it would be harder because we've definitely, on the flip side of her being a host, have gotten the request for her to be a guest on things. And it's like, I have no idea who you are, never heard of you before. Like, why is this important to, bring our brand into your brand? Like, why does this make
Hmm.
sense to have this kind of partnership almost? But I think it all comes back to like what's kind of current in marketing right now is your personal brand also. Like more and more people are waking up to the fact that like you do have an audience and you can engage them if you are consistent with building a presence on whatever channel makes the most sense. Most cases it's LinkedIn for marketers. And like I think the more that you can build that social clout, then the easier it is for you to get the guests that you want. It's similar from people saying, hey, I'm I started posting on LinkedIn daily. I built up all these followers, and now I have recruiters DMing me every, couple times a week. I think it
Yeah.
can definitely be the same thing with your podcast, and you should be able to have people going, "Hey, love that post you put out. I think it would definitely resonate with my audience if you could come on my podcast and talk about that." "Oh yeah, I've seen you interact with our there's that handshake that kind of goes on over time through your personal brand rather than just like cold outreach podcast guests. There's a time and a place for that, but I think the more effective and better quality conversations would come from kind of stuff like that.
Yeah, that like natural progression. I think that's the key too. It sounds like there's a tipping point that you all experience where we've seen that too. It's like you have to get started and you get some of those friendlies on your show
Mm-hmm.
early,
Mm-hmm.
build some of that momentum. And then once you get some visibility to what you're doing, once you start to really refine how the podcast is produced, you're able to take that momentum and
Yeah.
just naturally bring people into the fold. And you all have done some of that. And so Nolan, once you do have someone that has agreed to come on the show, what happens at that point? Like what prep work is done between you and the host and what material is created even before the recording session?
So once they've agreed to come on, then Kaylee would send them a Chili Piper meeting invite, which, just talk about Chili Piper for a second,
Yeah.
allowed her to build a custom meeting template to have all of the required things already ready, pre-populated in the meeting invite. So she can just go, click podcast interview, 45-minute, send to this person. And then there on their calendar, they've got everything that's expected. Here's a link to, maybe a prep sheet. Here's a link to kind of best practices. Here's examples of other episodes, all within, on their Google Calendar. So they never miss it or forget it in their inbox. So then, here it's time to come record. They hop on a Riverside.fm call to get that high quality content. And then really it's the host pinging me saying, "Hey, like we did the call, it went okay. Here's a couple things that happened. Here's a couple notes." And then it's on me, based on our release schedule to slot that into my editing workflow and get that through all the way through production.
And are you working with the host beforehand to craft an angle or questions or how is that like organized even before the guest shows up?
So that's something that we kind of did a postmortem on 2021 in
Mhm.
January and really thought like, okay, what went well, what didn't go well, and then what's kind of like moonshot dreams for 2022. And out of that, we identified that guest prep was one of the things that really was lacking. Like because Kaylee is so good at, you know, knowing the demand gen space and being able to just on the fly ask the right questions, it really worked. But we could have had way more meaningful conversations if we would have had more time to be able to prep for guests. Always aspiring to the hot ones level of research that can go into an interview. And that's what
Yeah.
we wrote down. We're like hot ones level type questions because like, that's a whole nother episode. We could go dissect why hot ones is so good, right? But it comes down to the questions, right? Because they're so good. And so I I didn't have a lot of say in the angles because I wanted to lean on Kaylee's expertise in the demand gen space specifically. But we did identify a potential future hire of like a podcast production coordinator that could help take a guest list, do some initial intel, guest research, really dig deep on social media and different things and build that. And I have a whole job description I wrote a few weeks ago actually that kind of goes over all those responsibilities that would really take a lot of that prep work off both the host and myself to then here's your cheat sheet on this person. And that's something
Yeah.
that we wanted to implement.
Yeah, I dig that approach, like that producer role that is heavily involved in pre-production. And are you familiar with Andrew Warner at all, the host of Mixer G
No, I'm
podcast
not.
startups? So he's done, I think, over 2,100 interviews of
Wow.
startup, yeah, founders and stuff. And I had him on the show like last week. We're releasing it soon, but he broke down his whole process and that researcher producer is a big part of like just keeping that detail in your episodes, and you really do need some of that research up front and you need help along the way.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you're kind of you've experienced some of that I wouldn't say pain, but it's like, this is something we want to improve,
Hmm.
and that's where you're gonna focus in on that area, and I think
Yeah,
that's a good route to take because if you do more of that work up front, there it does have really a lot of benefits downstream with the whole episode and the show in general.
exactly. I
Um,
think I think we got lucky, honestly, because just again of her experience in the demand gen space and being able to just know exactly what questions based on like her guest list was built on her network, and so she already knew a lot about them, and that was in
yeah,
our favor. But it's not scalable across, okay, we're doing maybe an episode, every other week. How do we get to 2 episodes a week? Probably not by doing that current process. It's probably
yeah.
involving that other producer role in there to do that research.
And Nolan, you mentioned so your host is recording in Riverside. You,
Hmm.
you got your high resolution recordings, and then I'm assuming you step in at that point. But what happens after that? Recording session's done. Kaylee's notified you. Hey, we actually recorded. We had a good conversation. It's in your court now.
Yeah. The other piece of that is we leverage Asana on our marketing team for project management. And we built out a podcast production board where it's kind of in that Trello type column view, and you've got guest queue or podcast episode queue of just like different topics or guests that we want on the show, and then she's working through outreaching to those, and then got a whole bunch of automation set up where it brings it through like pre-production, post-production, distribution, approval, whatever. And so when an episode's ready and it's been recorded, that card in Asana moves over into post-production, and then I'm notified and I can go in and there's the link to the Riverside. I'm pulling those clips down, and then I'm putting those into Descript and starting my content editing, and then using Descript really as our all-in-one like podcast. Like we're sweetening the audio there, where I'm cutting between the angles of, because
Hmm.
it is a video podcast. I'm cutting between guest and host. I'm really doing all the lifting into Script, and then identifying content for audiograms along the way. Highlighting stuff to go back to, and then export audio, export video, export 2 or 3 audiograms ideally, and then um, video goes to YouTube, audio goes, we use Sounder as our distribution platform. So audio goes there, and then audiograms get pinged over to our social media team for LinkedIn, Instagram. I think we even put a couple out on TikTok just to see how an audiogram would work on TikTok.
Yeah.
And then let the audience enjoy.
And Nolan, what's the editing process on your side? Are you trying to maintain the flow of the conversation? Are you moving things around a lot? Like, what's the process there?
Yeah, I'll listen from like I'll try to listen obviously from an audience perspective, and go, are we lingering too long on this topic? Could we move on? Does this make the guest or the host sound less than ideal? Like, does this make them not sound as intelligent as they actually are? Like, can I help make them be the best version of themselves without putting words in their mouth or splicing every other word into, something that they didn't actually say? But I wasn't really moving structure too much. I kept it pretty
Mhm.
linear in terms of just flow of conversation. And I worked with Kaylee a lot on episode structure and topics and stuff, so we didn't have to do as much, hopefully, in post. A lot of it was done more in the recording live, having her steer the conversation rather than like needing to do a whole bunch of, pivot cuts in the edit. And she would do the intro live, she'd do the outro live, and then we'd, maybe move those around a little bit for timing. And then manually cutting between angles, but I think Descript now even has like a auto switch feature now based on who's speaking. I haven't tried it out
Yeah.
yet, but yeah, I was leveraging Riverside's auto switch feature for a bit, but I lost that control over the 2 different layers of video because it's obviously baked into one file. Um,
Yeah. And
and
you
so
want that, yeah, the
yeah,
different tracks. Yeah.
yeah. So need to try that on in the script. But yeah, in turn back to content editing, really it was probably more stuff that's longer. I was probably cutting stuff down, just like I think you already said this point and you kind of came back to it,
Mhm.
either on the guest or the host side. Like I think you're repeating yourself a bit. We could probably lose this. But I tried to maintain the flow of conversation so it was as conversational as possible. It didn't feel like an interview in terms of like question one, answer, okay, sweet, question 2, answer. Like, I just want it to feel more of like you're kind of fly on the wall kind of vibe.
Yeah. And Nolan, since we're talking through Descript and how you're using it in your workflow, you mentioned it's really your all-in-one tool that's enabling all the other assets that you're creating. So on the video side, like what are you doing to add elements to it? Because we sort of met when Descript launched season 2, which had a
Mhm.
lot of features around social video. So what have you done maybe differently, or have you taken advantage of any of those new features so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Really more so for our audiograms. Our video podcast we is pretty low budget in terms of the production of what you're watching. It is really like it almost I would say it's almost even closer to a webinar in terms of like
Hmm.
the feel of like this is more of a raw chat, and I think that's just what resonated with our audience rather than something really 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 produced. That was part of our postmortem, was talking about more produced intros and outros, separate from the recording, and it's stuff that we could definitely work on. But yeah, for the new Descript features, the social stuff like the waveforms, the progress bars, I think were really important just because you want your audience to know how long they're buying in for, watching an
Yeah,
audiogram. Like, okay, how much time am I dedicating to this
right.
to watch it? And I think you get better buying that way. Yeah, some of the waveform stuff, like I told the Descript team, I was like, you guys just saved me like hours. Like
Yeah,
if I was to manually make a waveform, like let's say take an audiogram, put it in After Effects and try to like make something that looks nice, is on brand, just the level of detail that you can change right into script and have it actually look all cohesive and nice and work is huge. I showed it
yeah.
to we just hired a new editor at Chili Piper and I showed him to script. He'd never heard of it before. And he's like, After Effects feels so clunky and just archaic compared to, to be able to, and we're getting really deep in the weeds now, but to be able to take like
Yeah.
a waveform layer and to be able to like stretch it out across your composition and not have it do weird things, like it just dynamically scales,
Yeah.
like that kind of stuff, that level of just what Descript has built into their product. Um, I think it's pretty underappreciated because coming from the video
Yeah.
production world, it's so smooth.
Yeah, it's like Descript understands what these things are, whereas After Effects, it's like everything's built from scratch almost.
Mhm.
It's like you gotta create the waveform and then put
Mhm.
all these different, animations to it, and that's the thing that we do. We've struggled, along the way as to how much is in Descript and how much do we finish in Premiere and After
Mhm.
Effects, and
Mhm.
we're always playing with that workflow. The one nice thing though that, and we do this with every project, is we've used the export to Premiere feature quite
Yes.
heavily since they
Yes.
enabled that, which is awesome. You have all these assets built, and you're distributing, and you're getting these assets out there to where your audience is located, and we'll get to that in a second. I did want to dive into some of the feedback, right, that you're providing Kaylee along the way,
Mhm.
because you're this person, you're listening to the entire
Mhm.
conversation from an editing perspective. So you're kind of like going through it with a fine tooth comb after the fact. So how does that feedback work so far? Like, how do you share some of this information with the host?
Yeah, it would really be pretty collaborative just over Slack direct messages or we're hopping on like a quick just podcast sync. Like let's just chat about the last few episodes. Really nothing super official, just as it came. And a lot of the feedback was maybe like on, filler words that I identified that, the host would repeat, at the end, like saying like a yeah, no, or like a yeah, 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 like just kind of like the way that you would end a sentence every time to help just be aware and to work on that and develop, more cohesive sentences in terms of like they're not all the same. The way they end isn't all the same. And taking reins of the conversation, like if you're on a topic and then your guest has, gone down a rabbit trail, like I've done a few times here, and you've done a great job of bringing it back to the main
I won't
point.
let you go down that rabbit trail. I'll bring it back.
Yeah. But like given that type of feedback of just like, hey, at this point it would have been good to just grab the reins a bit and,
Yeah.
acknowledge what they've just said, but then go, hey, that's awesome. Let's go back to, this topic that you were just talking about, like, and bringing it back to kind of the home base of those talk points that you kind of planned ahead of the episode.
tell me how that feedback worked. Like sometimes it's hard to give constructive feedback, and how do you feel like it was received, and then what what was the impact of it? Like how,
hmm
did Kaylee respond to
hmm
that? And do you see like some of the benefits downstream in the editing process?
Yeah, 100%. Like I said, she'd never hosted a podcast before, and so it
Yeah.
really was a confidence exercise for her of like, I'm scared out of my mind to do this first episode. Like I don't even know. I don't feel like I know what I'm doing. And my feedback was like, this is just a one-on-one chat with somebody that you respect and know their background, and this is just like a coffee chat. Like, hey, I just want to get to know you a bit better. You want to get to know me a bit better. Let's share some tips and tricks across the industry and how we can help each other, and record that. And that was kind of the impetus of building that confidence of just hitting record and putting yourself out there. And then honestly, people only want to be helped as much as they want to be helped. And so, thankfully, she was just like, hey, just give it to me. Tell me what's wrong. Tell me what's
Yeah.
not working. Tell me where you can tell me if it sucks. Like, we could scrap the whole episode if it needs to be. Like, just took ego out of the picture, as a host, and just yielding to the producer of just like, I understand that I'm the host and I'm conducting these interviews, but at the end of the day, it has to be listenable for an audience and engage and actually add value, and not just be a rambling session. Like, it needs to add value to somebody's time. And thankfully, I had that honest, open feedback loop.
Yeah, and I think that there are a couple of things here that you pointed out that I think is important. Number one, you mentioned just having that conversation, right, as a starting point. And I feel like that's one challenge that we have when we're working with folks is sometimes they want to add so many layers to the podcast right away. It's like we want to be
Mm-hmm.
very different. We want to put a narrative piece in this. We want to have an outside voiceover, tie segments together. And I'm like, goodness, we haven't even had the host record a conversation yet
Yeah.
with a guest, and you have to walk before you run, and I know that's very cliche, but I feel like folks do have to experience that a little bit to get some of that practice in play. You do need some reps, and I think that you all have taken that approach, and that's what's benefiting you now. You're able to
Mm-hmm.
add little incremental adjustments along
A
the way.
hundred
So.
percent. 100%. I think it comes down to like, I think what people miss, to your point, is the story. At the end of the
Yeah.
day, you're telling a story. You're helping facilitate a storytelling session with a person who has a story to tell. And as a host, it's your job to guide them through that story. Even if it is a tactical, tips and tricks and deep dive nerd session on how you run. At the end of the day, you're telling a story of how there was a pain point. This person solved a pain point with a system and a framework. And now there's a solution. And what are the benefits? There's a story arc. You had tension, you have resolve, and then you have how it's been since then. And that's a compelling episode. But I
Yeah.
think people get caught up. It's same with my job in video. Like, video is an infinite canvas, right? Like, you open Premiere, I can do anything I want. I can show
Yeah.
anything I want. And it's the same with podcasting. Like, we could do a whole narrative to something pseudo marketing thing, and it's this thematic, whatever. And it's like, if you just tell good stories, people will listen, because
Yeah.
as humans, we're wired to listen to stories.
Yeah, and it's hard to resist that because, and that's the classic issue, and of course, you've seen it, like you said, a lot with video, where if you have a blank canvas, it's almost worse because,
Mm-hmm.
yes, you have complete creative freedom, but also you have no guardrails, no parameters to work from, and that creates this paralysis effect where you're not even sure which direction to go, and
A
you're
hundred
kind of
percent.
stuck. Yeah.
100%. There's an author, Erwin McManus, and he talked about creativity and said creativity's chaos. Like, let's say you have a square and you've just got all these nebulas floating around, and that's your creativity. But when creativity becomes something cohesive is when there's a conduit for it to flow through, and there's guardrails and there's a framework. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. Is like, you have a podcast, you could do all these things, but when you put up a framework of a show structure that first gets the fundamentals right, then you can start layering in those other elements that build and scale and add value to your production quality. But you got to put those guardrails at first to funnel that content through, and then you can make it shiny and flashy and do all the things with it.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm going to steal that segment from you, Nolan, and use it on our side. So I'll just let you know now. I think that, yeah, it's a great description, and we try to articulate it that way because it is hard. And I think the framework and just having that structure in place gives you the necessary freedom that you need to be creative. And in that said, now that you have this show structure in place, like what are some of the things that you're doing on the distribution side? Because back to your point earlier, where you put all this effort into this conversation, you have Kaylee, having a really good conversation. How does this then work for you as a marketing team?
Yeah. So it's thinking like any other piece of marketing content is, once it's created, what's the distribution and where is it going to go and what's it going to live? And hopefully, you're treating your podcast like a media arm at any agency or like advertising agency. Like, you see a Super Bowl ad, but there's 5 other ads that come out of that Super Bowl ad, right? And it's, how are you recycling this content into, let's say you're hosting a B2B podcast and you want to reach different personas with one piece of content. There's probably content within your episode that could speak to different personas. We have to go in there and cut those out and create, let's say you have this one episode, but you could have 5 different clips that come out of that, right? That you could put paid spend behind to reach all your different personas. But you have to think in this recycled content mindset, and not recycled in like, we're not trying to do new things, but it's back to distribution. There's so much you can do with that one piece. It can meet people in so many different places, whether that's even as we've talked about this as a marketing team, like, and we want to get better at this, but we've talked through the theory of like turning content marketing into videos, using content articles that have been written and turning those into video scripts. But then we've started to think about, okay, what about video content, either a podcast or a customer story or whatever, and turning that into written content? Because one statement that, like, let's say we talked about, one sentence or one paragraph that we talked about, you could quote that in an article about the topic that we're talking about, and that could link to your podcast episode. You could embed your audiogram clip on LinkedIn that points to the article, but there's a CTA to, hey, listen to the podcast to get the full conversation. Like, there's so much you can do to create this nice cyclical loop of, hey, I'm going to listen here, but it points to that, and then I can watch this here. And, it's ultimately creating a brand that's bingeable across all your different channels, right? Like, that's the ideal end state, is that your brand, we see it all the time. We see Salesforce is launching, here's a video platform for all of our people that are into Salesforce, Webflow, the maker of the crazy website, building platform. They have Webflow TV now. It's all about creating something where you can keep your audience engaged within your brand, and you don't need those platforms to do that. You have LinkedIn, you have Twitter, you have YouTube, you have podcasts, you have your blog, you have your newsletter. For us, it was embedding the most recent episode of Demand Gen Chat in our customer newsletter. Tons of new engagement, tons of new listeners. They're like, I didn't know this existed. This is awesome. Like, we're marketers selling to marketers, and marketers are listening to our marketing podcast now. Like, we're quoting, we're putting audiograms, we're doing all these different things.
It's funny that you included the podcast in your customer newsletter. I feel like a lot of folks forget about that. Like, the content that you create in the podcast is also useful, not only for prospects and on the marketing side, but also on the customer side and just customer success in general. And you can kind of think about things from a couple different angles there. And Nolan, you mentioned like going from audio video content to written, and then even going the other way. And I think that's interesting too. I mean, just example here in this episode, like the gentleman that you brought up, the author for that book, could be a whole separate article on that strategy of creativity. And then we could tie it back into how a podcast fits that type of framework. And that could be an article. And that's all just stemming from maybe a 30-second statement that you had for an author that I had no idea about. And now I'm going to go check that out and dig deeper into it. And I feel like that the podcast creates, and someone mentioned this to me the other day, just like those moments of serendipity that you can't really predict, and they just happen naturally as you're you're having those conversations. So I think that's a great point. In considering that you have all this video background, like what do you like the most about podcasting?
Yeah. It's been really exciting to dive more. It's been probably over the past, I would say 2 years, really diving into podcasting. And what I've loved about it so much is you're almost refining back to storytelling. You're refining a lot of the extra bits out. And you have to be so intentional about the storytelling. Because again, back to what I said before, like as humans, we're wired for storytelling. Like we want to listen to interesting things that either educate us, entertain us, empathize with us, or whatever. And it's diluting out some of the flashy extra bits, and it's back to human connection, conversation, sharing wisdom, learning, growing, improving. And also, it's content that can be consumed unlike other pieces of content. When we launched Demand Gen Chat, we had all this amazing feedback, and we had, let's say, a sales rep in Sweden saying, "Hey, I'm listening to your episode while I'm biking home from the office." He can't read an article while he's
Yeah.
biking home from he can't watch a YouTube video, can't watch a TikTok or anything. Like the only piece of content that can reach this person when they're biking, running, at the gym, driving in the car, and doing all these different things is a podcast. Like, yeah, you can do audiobooks and all that, but when we're talking about conversations and, that kind of format. So it got me really excited because coming from a video production background, I've always been bound to my eyeballs have to be watching something
Yeah.
to be engaging with it. But then it's like, wait, we can take some of this skill. We can translate this to conversation and audio, and we can do both. We can have a video podcast and it's an audio podcast. Now, one piece of content serving two mediums, and they can be consumed in different ways and in multiple formats. And that's really exciting for me, just because I can now reach even more people with interesting stories wherever they're at any time, based on how they decide to slot it into their schedule.
I dig it. We're speaking the same language for sure. Yeah, very similar kind of path there. And in considering that with some of the things that you're getting from podcasting, like what were some of the changes that you might be looking to make with Demand Gen Chat this year? Because you mentioned that you did, like this analysis on some of the episodes you did last year. So what are you looking forward to modify moving forward?
Yeah, I think definitely different show formats. So obviously keeping the more raw, linear, just like fly in the wall type chat, but then also maybe introducing some more like larger panel type discussions that are even more raw and less edited, that are more like, again, you're a fly on a wall for like a bunch of experts in their areas, even maybe having different opinions, and they're, a little bit of a debate going on. Some more solo episodes where it's, let's talk about what's happening right now in, the space, whether it's demand gen or marketing or whatever, and be able to just, hey, let's chat about kind of current events going on right now. And what does that mean? Like if it's privacy tracking, if it's, different things going on right now that's relevant, then it's like, let's talk about that. And we kind of call those hot takes. That's how we kind of branded those. Like we did one of those when Clubhouse was blowing up, and it's like, Clubhouse is not going to replace your marketing team. Like,
Yeah.
it's just like, let's have a hot take around that. And that was just Kaylee coming on and just, and it wasn't a full 20 minutes. It was maybe like 12 minutes long or something like that, but it still was something you can just add to your queue and listen to, and just hear what's kind of going on, almost like a news update. So I think like just different multi-formats, and then better guest research. Like I mentioned, I'd love to see us start to expand the team a bit more. I think that at Chili Piper, we also have an opportunity to start a couple more podcasts outside of Demand Gen Chat. So kind of building out some different marketing persona based podcasts that speak to different audiences outside of Demand Gen, and then exploring different production things. If it is producing an intro, producing an outro, now that we kind of got our stride going, like how
Mhm.
can we just level this up and just be better?
Yeah. I dig it. I actually had a post this morning on LinkedIn. You're speaking to like different shows for very specific audiences, and LinkedIn is actually getting into the podcast game
Yeah,
now.
I saw that. Yeah, I saw your
Yeah,
post.
and I thought that was interesting because they have everyone from basically the co-founder
Mhm.
of LinkedIn, and then you also have this situation where they're acquiring shows or bringing them into their network, and it's all designed to reach very specific audiences versus just having one big show. So I'll be excited to follow along with you all and how you roll that out and handle it,
Mhm.
because I think that really is the next stage is to just get very specific with the conversations you have. That way you're not, trying to fit everything into just one big broad show and tackle too much at one time. I think that'll be the challenge there.
I completely agree. What I'll say to that though is I've seen brands come out of the gate with like 5 podcasts all at once. And to me, I think that's a wrong approach because as an audience member, if I've never interacted with your brand before, I don't know where to go. I don't know like
Yeah.
where I might fit in. And like I would say to those people like build a podcast for your biggest persona at your company and build an audience around that. So when you launch these other shows, you can have people self-select and go, yeah, I identify with that. And you already have that tribe of people rather than like paralysis by analysis. And it's like, wow, you have 10 shows. I don't want to miss out on anything. So I'm just not going to listen. Right.
Yeah.
And I've seen them come out of the gate with 5, 10 podcasts or whatever, different, like they're building their media arm of shows and they overlap. And there's a lot of like, it's just like a different title, but it's a lot of the same things and it's not clearly defined. And I think it just comes from a place of not knowing what your show's about yet because it's new. Like Demand Gen Chat evolved and we found our voice over the course of 17 episodes. Now, if we're ready to launch another podcast at Chili Piper, we know what to not cover and what not to talk about and how we're different so we can serve both those audiences well rather than giving them this watered down kind of just it's a branded podcast. We're going to sell to
Yeah.
you half of the podcast. Like that's not what we're about.
Yeah.
That's the other thing I have with branded podcasts. It's just, it feels like a sales pitch and people tune out.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I think this just speaks to like what we were talking about earlier is just adding layers to your show,
Mhm.
not trying to do too much at once. And then, and it's like you said, you're going to find things along the way, and maybe that is a different show format that you answer that challenge with, or maybe it's creating a whole different podcast. So there are a lot of different ways to handle those requirements that come up, and that's really the beauty of podcasting, and that's really the beauty of continuing to publish and get that feedback, which is a big part of what we talked about today, and using that feedback to figure out what to do next. So, well, Nolan, I think that's a good place to stop right there. I mean, great information. Thanks for taking us through, your experience with the show, and we're looking forward to following you along. Where can people go to find out more about you and Demand Gen Chat?
Yeah, I would say LinkedIn is the best place. It's just Nolan McCoy. You can find me there. Semi-active there. Just giving updates on what I'm doing, what I'm working on, stuff that's going on. That's where you can find me.
Awesome. And then also the Descript Live, they'll bring you on stage and ask you some questions too. You get you in person once in a while. Well,
Yeah.
cool. Well, yeah, there's probably even a testimonial in here for Descript somewhere. I think I could point them to that as
Mhm.
well. I talk to them a lot. So, well, Nolan, thanks a bunch. I appreciate you joining me on Recorded Content today.
Thanks so much, Tristan. It was a blast.